The floorboard came up with a groan that seemed to cut straight through the silence of the empty room, and Eva Keller's fingers closed around something cold and metal before her mind had time to process what she was feeling. She already had one locket. It was hanging around her neck right now, pressed against her sternum like a brand, warm from her skin. She had found it 2 days after Elias Carson rode into Redemption Creek, left on her windowsill like some kind of wordless declaration. And now here was a second one, identical in weight and feel, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of the room he rented at the back of Dottie Me's boarding house. Her hand was shaking. She opened her fist and looked down at the thing lying in her palm. Same oval shape. Same tarnished silver casing etched with tiny wildflowers along the rim. She flipped it over and her breath left her body in a single, silent rush, because the inscription on the back was not the same as the one around her neck. The one she wore read simply, "E." This one read, "M." She was still crouching on the floor with her skirt pooled around her knees and dust on her hands when the door opened behind her, and Elias Carson walked in from the hall and stopped dead. For a moment neither of them moved. Eva stared at him from the floor. He stared at the locket in her hand. The afternoon light came through the single window at a low angle and painted everything amber and gold, and Eva thought distantly that it was a cruel kind of beauty for such an ugly moment. "You told me it was safe keeping," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You told me you left things in the floorboards because you trusted no lock in this town. You said that to me 4 days ago. You stood right there by that window, and you said it like it was the most natural thing in the world." Elias did not speak. "Who is M?" Eva asked. He closed his eyes just briefly. Just long enough for her to see something pass through him like a tremor, and then he opened them again and crossed the room and crouched down so they were level with each other, and he did not try to take the locket from her. He just looked at it the way a man looks at a wound he has been carrying for so long he has forgotten what it felt like before. "Her name was Miriam," he said. And that was how Eva Keller learned that the drifter who had been slowly dismantling every wall she had built around her heart was not just a wandering man with a crooked smile and 2 kind eyes. He was a man with a ghost. She had not planned on caring about Elias Carson at all. When he first rode into Redemption Creek on a Wednesday in late September of 1878, Eva had been behind the counter of Keller's general store, tallying figures in the ledger that her father had left her when he died, and she had looked up at the sound of the bell above the door and registered only the basics. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low, dust on everything. She had seen 100 men like him come through this stretch of New Mexico territory, and she had learned from her father's mistakes and her own that drifters were men you sold goods to and sent on their way. She had asked him what he needed. He had said flour, salt, tobacco, and a box of cartridges for a Colt single-action army. Then he had looked around the store with those gray eyes that caught the light in a way she had not expected, and he had said, "You run this place alone." "I do," she said. "Smart operation," he said. "Organized." It was such an odd compliment that she had paused with the cartridge box in her hand and looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had assumed. Maybe 30, 31. There were lines around his eyes that did not come from youth, but his jaw was clean-shaved and his hands, when he set his coins on the counter, were steady and careful. "You passing through?" she asked, because that was the question every merchant learned to ask. Passing through meant one sale, staying meant a running account. "Might stay a while," he said. "Looking for work." Eva had said, "Dottie Me's boarding house is on the north end of the main street. Tell her Eva Keller sent you and she will give you the decent room." He had looked at her when she said her name, and something she could not identify had moved across his face. Then he had taken his goods, tucked them under his arm, and said, "Much obliged, Miss Keller," and walked out. She had gone back to her ledger. She had not thought about him again until the next morning when he appeared in the doorway of the store at 8 o'clock sharp, with 2 fat rabbits hanging from one hand and a question about whether she was interested in fresh game. She had told him she was not running a butcher's operation, and he had said he knew that. But he had more than he needed, and it seemed wasteful to let them rot when the boarding house was overpriced, and he was trying to make his money last. There was something so plainly practical about the statement that Eva found herself agreeing before she had thought it through. She paid him a fair price, sent the rabbits to the back, and sold them to old Ray's the cook by noon. She made a modest profit. Elias Carson came back the following morning with 3 rabbits and a brace of quail. By the end of the first week, he was bringing game 3 mornings out of 5, and by the end of the second week Eva had stopped pretending she was not watching for the sound of his boots on the porch steps. She told herself it was a business arrangement. She told herself a lot of things. What she could not tell herself was why she had started keeping the store open a quarter hour later each evening, or why she had begun setting aside the newspaper from Albuquerque for him when it came in on the Thursday stage, knowing that he read anything he could get his hands on. He had told her that once, casually, leaning against the counter while she sorted a new shipment of dry goods. He had said he had not had regular access to books or papers for a long time, and when she had asked him why, he had gone quiet in that particular way of his that was not evasive so much as it was careful. She had learned to read the difference. Redemption Creek was a town of about 240 souls in 1878, sitting in a valley between 2 ridges of the San Andres Mountains, close enough to the Rio Grande that the air in spring smelled of water and cottonwood. It had been founded by her father, a German immigrant named Heinrich Keller, who had come west with a wagon of trade goods and the stubborn conviction that commerce was the lifeblood of civilization. He had been right about the commerce. He had been wrong about his heart, which had given out on a cold January morning 3 years ago, leaving Eva at 24 with a store, a debt to the Territorial Bank, a 2-room apartment above the shop, and no family closer than a cousin in Missouri who had never written back to a single letter. She had paid off the debt in 18 months. She had not asked anyone for help. She had organized the store with a precision that would have made her father proud and a ruthlessness that would have surprised him, because Eva Keller had learned that sentiment was a luxury and clarity was survival. She had also learned, somewhere in those 3 years of solitude and ledger books and dusty territorial sunsets, that loneliness had a particular weight to it that you could mistake for strength if you carried it long enough. Elias Carson made her feel the weight again. It started the night of the harvest social at the end of September, which Redemption Creek held every year in the churchyard behind Pastor Albright's whitewashed chapel. Eva went because she was expected to, because she was the most established merchant in town, and absence would have been conspicuous and foolish. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool with the cream collar that her father had bought her the Christmas before he died, and she arranged her brown hair up in the way she had seen in a fashion paper from St. Louis. Elias Carson was there because, she later found out, the widow Dottie Mee had told him it was expected of her boarders during their first month in town, and he had nodded and shown up in a clean shirt, and his coat brushed free of trail dust, and he had stood at the edge of the firelight looking like a man who was present in body and somewhere far away in mind. Eva had been standing near the refreshment table, listening to Sheriff Brackett's wife talk about the price of calico, when she had felt someone step up beside her and heard a low voice say, "Is it always this loud?" She had turned and found Elias at her shoulder, holding a cup of cider and looking genuinely pained by the noise of the fiddle and the dancing. "Yes," she said, "once a year exactly this loud. And you come every year." "I run the only general store in town," she said. "My presence is a form of advertising." He looked at her sideways, and she saw the corner of his mouth pull into that crooked thing that she had been trying not to catalog. "That is a very cold way to describe a dance," he said. "I am a very practical person," she said. "I have noticed," he said. They had stood there for a while in silence that was somehow not uncomfortable, and then he had offered to get her more cider and she had said yes before she could apply her practical nature to the decision. And by the end of the evening they had walked twice around the churchyard together, talking about nothing and everything. the San Andres Mountains black against the stars, the smell of wood smoke and cooling October air around them. And Eva had gone home with her cheeks warm and her heart performing strange, irregular movements against her ribs that she categorically refused to name. She found the first locket on her windowsill the morning after the social. She had opened the shutters at first light, the way she always did, and there it was on the sill. Silver, oval, etched with wildflowers, warm already from the early sun. She picked it up and turned it over and saw the single letter E on the back and thought for a moment that it was something her father might have left, some forgotten trinket of her mother's, though her mother had died when Eva was 7 and her father had not been a sentimental man. She opened it and it was empty. No portrait inside, no lock of hair, just the hollow interior of a locket that had once held something and held nothing now. She wore it anyway, without fully understanding why. When Elias came in that morning with his game, she did not mention it. She watched his face and he did not mention it either, and she decided she was not ready to ask. She was not ready for whatever the answer was going to cost her. But now here they were. Her on the floor of his rented room with the second locket in her hand and dust on her knees. Him crouching across from her with the name Miriam in the air between them like something solid. "Tell me," Eva said. He sat down on the floor properly, with his back against the wall and his long legs bent and his hands loose between his knees. She had never seen him sit that way before, loose and open, and she understood somehow that it was a kind of offering. "She was my wife," he said. Eva absorbed this. Her practical heart reassembled itself around the information, made room for it, did not break, not yet. "Was," she said. "She died," he said, 4 years ago, fever. Out in Colorado in a mining camp outside Durango in the winter of 1874. The silence stretched. "The lockets," Eva said. He took a slow breath. "I had them made before we were married. A man in Kansas City, a silversmith. He made 2 identical ones except for the initials. E and M, one for her, one for me to give to her when we had a daughter someday. Never did. We had 3 years and then she was gone, and I have been carrying both of them ever since." He paused. "I left hers in the floorboard because it felt wrong to keep carrying it and I could not bring myself to let it go entirely. Floorboards felt safer than a grave." Eva looked down at the locket in her palm. "M for Miriam. And the other one," she said, "the one you left on my windowsill." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The other one was always meant to be given away. I just had not found anyone I wanted to give it to." Eva looked up at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes that caught everything. "That was a very direct statement," she said, "for a man who has been circling around me for 3 weeks without saying a word." "I have not been circling," he said. "I have been learning. There is a difference." She did not look away. "What have you learned?" he said. "That you are braver than anyone I have ever met, and you have no idea that you are. That you run that store like a general runs an army and it costs you something you do not admit. That you are lonely in exactly the same way I am lonely, which is the kind that looks like strength from the outside." Eva felt the weight she had been carrying for 3 years shift inside her chest. "You are very presumptuous for a drifter," she said. "I prefer to think of myself as observant," he said. She looked back down at the locket. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who can afford to make mistakes. I have a business and a reputation and obligations in this town. I cannot be some wandering man's brief occupation before he moves on." "I know," he said. "Do you?" She said, and there was an edge in it now, because this was the thing, the real thing, the dark past and the hidden motive she had been afraid of. "Because you have given me a locket and you have brought me rabbits every morning and you have talked to me at the harvest social and you have sat here now and told me about your dead wife, and I still do not know who you are, Elias Carson, or where you came from, or what you want that is not temporary." He met her eyes and held them. "Then ask me," he said. "Ask me anything you want to know." She almost did not believe the offer. But his voice was steady and his hands were loose, and he was still sitting on the floor of his room like a man with nothing to hide. And Eva Keller, who had survived 3 years alone in a frontier town by learning to read people with absolute accuracy, decided to trust what she was reading. She asked him everything. She asked about his family, and he told her. William Carson, his father, who had been a schoolteacher in Virginia before the war, who had moved the family to Missouri in 1865 after the wreckage of Reconstruction made Virginia untenable. His mother, Helen, who had grown kitchen gardens and sung hymns and died of pneumonia in 1869. A younger brother, Thomas, who was farming land in Kansas and writing letters Elias answered irregularly and felt guilty about. She asked about the war, and he told her that too, which she had not expected. He had been 16 in 1864 when his father's firm opposition to violence had collided with the grinding machinery of a conflict that did not care about opposition. And he had spent the final year of the war watching things he did not describe in specific terms, but that had left marks she could see in the way he sometimes went still and far away. She asked about Miriam, and he told her she had been a schoolteacher's daughter from a small town in Kansas, sensible and warm, 20 years old when they married in the spring of 1871. He had been 23. He told her about the mining camp outside Durango with a flatness in his voice that she recognized as the particular tone of grief that has been visited so many times it has worn itself smooth. He had worked a claim for 2 seasons, trying to find enough silver to build something, and instead he had found himself alone in the mountains in January with a wife in the ground and nothing left to stay for. He had been drifting since then. 4 years. New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, back up to Colorado, back down, working where he could find it, cattle drives and ranch hands, and once 6 months as a deputy sheriff in a town in Arizona that he had been glad to leave. "Why did you stay here?" Eva asked. "In Redemption Creek." He looked at her steadily. "Because when I walked into your store and you told me your name, something in me stopped moving." The air in the room was very still. Eva stood up from the floor, slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt with the precise, deliberate movements of a woman giving herself time to think. She set the locket down on the small wooden table near the window. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, looking out at the main street of Redemption Creek where old Herman Fitch was sweeping the stoop of the farrier's shop, and 2 women from the church auxiliary were walking toward the post office with their bonnets forward against the wind. Her town, her life. The practical life she had built out of grief and discipline and the stubborn refusal to need anyone. She turned around. Elias had gotten up from the floor. He was standing by the wall with his hands at his sides, and he looked like a man waiting for a verdict which she supposed was accurate. "I need time," she said. "All right," he said immediately. "That is not a no," she said. "I know," he said, and that crooked pull at the corner of his mouth appeared so briefly she almost missed it. She picked up the locket from the table, the one with M on the back, and she held it out to him. "This one belongs to Miriam," she said. "You should keep it, not in the floorboard." He looked at the locket in her outstretched hand, and then he took it and closed his fingers around it, and she thought she saw something in him settle. "I will keep it," he said, "and I will tell you when I am ready to put it down. That is the honest answer." "I know," she said. "I appreciate honesty more than most things." She left him there and walked back down the hall of the boarding house and out onto the main street and back to her store, and she stood behind her counter for a long time with her hand pressed flat against the ledger book, feeling the cold weight of the locket around her neck and trying to convince herself that practicality was still her strongest instinct. It was not. October deepened. The air over the San Andres came down cool and dry, and the cottonwoods along the creek went gold and then copper and then bare. The stage from Albuquerque came on Thursdays, and with it the mail and the papers and occasional travelers who needed provisions. Eva ran the store with the same efficiency she had always maintained, and Elias Carson continued to bring her game 3 mornings a week, and they continued to talk, and things between them continued to be exactly what they were, which was not quite courting and not quite friendship, and not quite anything she had a name for in her practical vocabulary. She learned things about him in pieces. That he read voraciously, anything she set aside for him and anything else he could find, and that he had opinions about what he read that were thoughtful and sometimes surprising. That he was funny in a dry, quiet way that crept up on her and made her laugh before she had decided whether it was appropriate. That he was scrupulously fair in all his dealings, and that the men he worked alongside, the ranch hands and hired help at the Grayson, spread east of town where he had taken on work, spoke of him with a respect that was not common for a man who had been in town less than 2 months. She also learned, from a conversation with Sheriff Brackett that was not quite gossip but not quite official either, that Elias Carson had stepped between a drunk ranch hand named Covey and a young Mescalero Apache man named Lupe who was in town selling hides, when Covey had decided that the ordinary injustice of intimidation was something he was entitled to practice in broad daylight. Elias had not drawn his gun. He had simply put himself in the space between the two men and said something to Covey in a voice too low for the sheriff to hear, and Covey had backed down with a snarl and ridden off, and Lupe had sold his hides and gone home without injury. Brackett told Eva this story with a raised eyebrow that suggested he was offering her information she might find useful. She found it very useful. The night it changed was a Thursday in mid-October. The stage had come in that afternoon, and among the mail was a letter for Eva from the Territorial Bank in Santa Fe, which informed her that her account was in excellent standing, and that the bank was prepared to offer her an extension of commercial credit at a favorable rate if she wished to expand her inventory for the winter season. This was good news. It was the kind of solid, practical good news that her father's ghost would have approved of. She was in a good mood when she closed the store at 7 o'clock, and on impulse, instead of going upstairs to her apartment, she walked down the main street to the small cantina that a woman named Rosaria Vila ran out of the ground floor of her house, where respectable people could get a meal and coffee on weekday evenings. Eva did not go often, but tonight she felt like the company of a room with other people in it. Elias was already there, sitting at the corner table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper she had set aside for him, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did something she felt all the way across the room. He did not smile exactly. It was more than a smile. It was like something switching on. She sat down across from him. Rosaria brought her coffee and the good pan de campo bread that she made on Thursdays, and Eva sat across from Elias Carson in the warm lamplight of the cantina and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and partway through the second hour, with the oil lamps burning low and the room mostly emptied out, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not say anything. He just held her hand. Eva looked down at their hands on the table, his larger and darker from the outdoor work, hers neat and careful-knuckled from the constant work of the store. She did not pull away. "I am not afraid of who you are," she said finally. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I think you are afraid of who I might leave you as." She looked up at him. "You have a disconcerting habit of being accurate. You are the most straightforward woman I have ever met," he said. "It is easy to be accurate about straightforward people." "Then be accurate about this," she said. "Are you staying?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him arrive at the answer, watched it move through him from whatever deep place it lived in, and then he said, "Yes, if you want me to, I am staying." Eva turned her hand over under his and held on. November came with its cold mornings, and its clear, hard sky, and Redemption Creek buttoned itself against the winter with the practical efficiency of a frontier town that had no room for the dramatic. Eva expanded her inventory as the bank letter had suggested, laying in extra stores of lamp oil and heavy wool and tinned goods that would carry the town through to spring. She hired a boy named Peter Drummond, 15 years old and industrious, to help with the heavy lifting on delivery days. Elias was hired on by the Grayson spread for the winter, which was unusual, as the Grayson family did not typically maintain a full crew through the cold months. But John Grayson, who was a man of few words and sharp judgment, had watched Elias work through October and decided he was worth the investment. The arrangement meant Elias would ride out to the Grayson place Monday through Friday and be back in Redemption Creek by Saturday afternoon. Saturday afternoons became the thing Eva looked forward to most. He would come into the store first, because that was practical, to pick up anything he had ordered or to pay his account, and they would talk over the counter, and then he would sometimes stay and help her with the end-of-week inventory, because he had a head for numbers that surprised her the first time she saw it and delighted her every time after. Then Rosaria's cantina for supper, or in the cold, cold evenings of deep November, her apartment above the store, where Eva would make coffee on the small iron stove, and they would sit on either side of the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind coming off the mountains, and talk. He told her about the territory. He had seen more of it than most men twice his age, not because he was adventurous by nature, but because grief had made him restless, and restlessness had carried him from one end of the Southwest to the other. He knew the trade routes and the water sources and the land formations with the casual accuracy of a man who had lived by paying attention to the landscape. He told her about the Chiricahua and the Mescalero and the complicated, grinding injustice of the reservation system, which he described without romance or dismissal, which made him different from most men she had spoken to about such things. He told her about things he had seen that were unjust and had not been able to change, and there was a real anger in him about those things, a moral anger that did not express itself as self-righteous noise, but as a quiet, bone-deep frustration that she found she shared. She told him things in return. About her father's immigration from Westphalia in 1849, the crossing and the long overland journey, and the years building the business in a territory that was not always welcoming to men with German names and German accents. About her mother, whom she remembered mostly in fragments and feelings, the smell of lavender water and the sound of a voice speaking a language Eva had almost entirely lost. About the 3 years since her father's death, the fear of the first winter and the pride of the second, and the settled, careful life she had built that was safe, but that had stopped feeling like enough sometime in the previous year without her quite noticing it until it was already true. Elias listened to all of it the same way he did everything, with complete, steady attention, and she trusted that attention more than she had trusted most things in her adult life. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday evening in late November, when the first real snow of the season had come down off the mountains, and was sitting on the rooftops of Redemption Creek in soft, undisturbed ridges. She had walked him to the door of her apartment at the top of the stairs, and they had been talking about something. She could not later remember what. And then they were not talking, and he was looking at her with those gray eyes, and he had leaned down and kissed her with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who had thought about this for a long time and wanted to do it exactly right. She kissed him back with the decisive certainty of a woman who had thought about it too. The snow outside lay very still, and the oil lamp on the table behind them sent warm light through the open door, and for a long moment afterward they stood with their foreheads together, and Eva felt the loneliness she had been carrying lift in her chest like a bird releasing from a branch. December brought the deeper cold, and with it, complications. The first was minor and manageable. A man named Harlan Rhodes, who ran the cattle operation on the western edge of Redemption Creek's territory, and considered himself the most significant person in town, regardless of evidence, took exception to Elias Carson's growing presence in his community. Rhodes was the kind of man whose influence depended on other men remaining uncertain of their standing, and Elias Carson was obviously not uncertain of his standing, and this was an irritation that Harlan Rhodes could not leave alone. He made remarks, at the barroom at the Silver Spur Saloon, at the post office where men gathered on mail days. He suggested, with the sidelong confidence of a man who believed his opinions were automatically credible, that a drifter without history or property had no business being so comfortable in a respectable widow's establishment. Eva heard about this through the efficient information network of a small frontier town before the week was out. She went to the Silver Spur, which she had entered exactly twice in her adult life, both times for business purposes, and she walked up to Harlan Rhodes where he was standing at the bar with his foreman, and she said, in her clearest and most carrying voice, "I understand you have been speaking about my private affairs, Mr. Rhodes. I want to let you know that my affairs are entirely my own business, that I am a free woman in full control of her establishment, and that I would consider it a considerable favor if you applied your opinions to something more relevant to your own life." The Silver Spur was quiet enough that the sound of Harlan Rhodes' boots on the floor was audible when he shifted his weight. "Now, Miss Keller," he started. "Thank you," Eva said, and turned and walked out. That particular complication resolved itself with the speed that small-town complications often do when they are addressed directly. The second complication was harder. A letter arrived on the Thursday stage in the third week of December, addressed to Elias Carson in care of Dottie Mee's boarding house, with a return address from Durango, Colorado. Eva did not know about the letter until Elias told her about it on the following Saturday, sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee growing cold in front of him, and a look on his face she had not seen before. "It is from the man who worked the claim next to mine in Durango," he said. "A man named Aldous Webb. He and Miriam were close. He was there at the end." He paused. "He is coming through New Mexico in January and he wants to stop here." Eva was quiet for a moment. "Do you want him to?" Elias looked at her. "I want you to know about it. I want there to be no hidden motive, no dark corner where I am keeping things from you. Aldous knew Miriam and he knew me then. I do not know what he will say or what seeing him will be like." Eva appreciated this more than she could have explained simply. She said, "Tell him to come. I would like to meet someone who knew you before." Elias looked at her for a moment with something complicated and grateful in his face, and then he said, "You are a remarkable woman, Eva Keller." "I am a practical one," she said, which is almost the same thing. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair by the standards of Eastern cities, but it was warm in its own frontier way. Pastor Albright held services on Christmas Eve that the whole town attended regardless of their personal relationship with theology, because it was expected, and because the candles and the singing were genuinely beautiful in the small whitewashed chapel. Eva sat in her usual pew near the left aisle, and Elias sat beside her for the first time, and she felt the weight and warmth of him there with a feeling she finally allowed herself to call exactly what it was. She loved him. She had not said it yet, but she knew it the way she knew the weight of her ledger book and the smell of the coming weather off the mountains. It was just true. After the service, he walked her back to the store and they stood outside in the cold, the snow on the mountains glinting under a very clear full moon, and he gave her a gift wrapped in brown paper, which turned out to be a small book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman that he had ordered through the store's supplier 2 months ago, and inside the cover he had written in his careful schoolteacher's son handwriting, "For Eva, who taught me that staying is the bravest thing." She gave him a pair of good leather gloves she had selected from the best stock in the store, and had lined herself with wool batting, practical and warm and precisely suited to his hands, and he put them on and held them up and looked at them with such genuine pleasure that she laughed. They stood on the porch of her store on Christmas Eve in 1878 with the moon on the snow and the sound of the town settling into its quiet, and he kissed her in the cold, and she kissed him back, and she decided that practical was only one of the things she was. Aldous Webb arrived on a Tuesday in the third week of January 1879, which came in on a bitter wind that made even the livestock sullen. He was a stocky, weathered man of perhaps 45 with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen real things and aged accordingly. He arrived on horseback, which given the cold and the terrain said something about his constitution. Eva met him first, because Elias was out at the Grayson place and would not be back until evening. Webb came into the store for supplies, and when he gave his name she knew immediately who he was, and she said so, and she watched something shift in his eyes, a mixture of assessment and surprise. "He told you about me," Webb said. "He tells me most things," Eva said. Webb looked at her for a long moment, the way an older man looks at someone he is measuring against a standard he holds privately. Then he said, "He is lucky, luckier than most men know to be." That evening in Rosaria's cantina, Eva sat at the table while Elias and Aldous Webb saw each other for the first time in 4 years, and she watched Elias go through something complicated and real. There was grief in it, the way grief attends any reunion that involves the absent. But there was something else too, something like relief, like a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time finally being permitted to set it down in the presence of someone who understands its weight. Webb was forthright and honest, a man without concealment. He talked about Miriam directly and without softening, and Eva appreciated that. He described her as she had apparently been, warm, stubborn, funny, braver than the circumstances warranted. He said she had loved Elias with a complete and practical love that asked nothing of him that he was not able to give. He said, near the end of the evening, looking at Eva, "She told me once in the last weeks that the worst thing she could imagine was Elias stopping. She said stopping would kill him quicker than anything. She made me promise to tell him that if I ever saw him again." The table was very quiet. Elias looked at the candle between them for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket and he set Miriam's locket on the table, the M locket, and he looked at it, and Eva watched him say goodbye to something. Not to Miriam, not to the love he had carried for her, but to the version of grief that had become a kind of identity, a reason to keep moving, a thing to protect against. He picked the locket up and handed it to Aldous Webb. "I would like you to keep this," he said, "for Miriam." "So someone who loved her has it." Webb took it and closed his hand around it and nodded once. Later, when Webb had retired to the room Dottie Mee had prepared for him and Eva and Elias were walking back to the store in the cold night air, she took his hand and held it, and they walked without speaking until they reached her door. "Are you all right?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, the way he did everything. Then he said, "I am better than I have been in 4 years. That is an honest answer." She squeezed his hand. "It is enough," she said. He looked at her in the moonlight and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the asking is not impulsive. I have thought about this every day since November, and probably before that if I am honest." Eva waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to stop being a man who boards at Dottie Mee's and works the Grayson spread and comes to your store 3 mornings a week. I want to be a man who is here, permanently, with you, if you will have me." She looked at him in the cold January night with the mountains behind him and the town around them and 4 months of knowing him layered like bedrock under her feet, and she said, "Yes, obviously yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since November." He laughed, which was a sound she loved, low and real and surprised out of him, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her with the same careful, deliberate certainty with which he did everything. And she put her face against the cold cloth of his coat and felt, for the first time since her father died, completely held. They were married in March. Pastor Albright officiated in the whitewashed chapel with almost the entire population of Redemption Creek in attendance, because a merchant's marriage was a community event in a small frontier town, and there was no resisting it. Dottie Mee made a cake with dried apple and cinnamon that was better than anything the occasion required. Aldous Webb, who had decided to stay in Redemption Creek through the winter, and had by March shown signs of staying considerably longer, stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and an expression that Eva could only describe as satisfied. Eva wore her blue wool dress and pinned a sprig of dried sage to the collar, because there were no fresh flowers in March in New Mexico, and she thought it looked better than flowers would have anyway. She wore both lockets, the E and the space where M had been and was not anymore, and Elias standing across from her at the altar saw them, and something passed through his face that she would remember her whole life. They spoke their vows in the straightforward, traditional words of the period, which were formal but sufficient, and when it was done, they walked out into the cold March sunshine as husband and wife, and the town made noise around them, and Eva thought, not for the first time, that practicality had nothing to do with any of it. Elias moved out of Dottie Me's boarding house and into Eva's apartment above the store, which required some rearrangement of furniture and a considerable amount of practical discussion about shared space that was also, in its way, deeply romantic. He took the small room at the back of the apartment that had been used for storage and installed a desk where he could read and write in the evenings after Eva had finished her accounts. They developed routines that intertwined with the naturalness of two people who had both been alone long enough to know exactly which adjustments were worth making. He continued working the Grayson spread through the spring, but John Grayson, whose judgment remained sharp, promoted him to foreman in April with a wage that changed the financial arithmetic of their life in a meaningful way. Eva used the expanded commercial credit from the Territorial Bank to add a dry goods annex to the store, a small room off the main floor with additional shelving, and hired Peter Drummond on permanently as a junior clerk. Spring in Redemption Creek came through the valley in its own unhurried way, cottonwoods greening along the creek and the smell of sage and new grass on the wind, and Eva Keller Carson, who had believed for 3 years that her life was essentially finished in its shaping, discovered that she had been wrong in the most wonderful possible way. She discovered in May that she was expecting a child. She told Elias on a Saturday evening, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight that had become the central image of her domestic happiness, and she watched him receive the news with the same steady attention he gave everything important, which in this case was followed by him closing his eyes briefly and then reaching across the table and taking her hand in both of his with a grip that was gentle and absolutely certain. "Are you well?" was the first thing he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I'm also slightly terrified, which I am telling you because you have established a precedent of me telling you everything." "You are not terrified," he said with the quiet accuracy that still, after months, managed to be charming rather than infuriating. "You are surprised. You like to plan things." "They are not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed, "they are not. You will plan this too, and you will be extraordinary at it." She looked at him across the lamp. "You are not allowed to be this confident on my behalf." "Someone has to be," he said. And he smiled at her, that real smile that reached his eyes and made the whole room warmer. Summer moved across the valley in long, hot days that smelled of baked earth and distant rain, and Eva expanded the store's operations with the methodical energy of a woman who had a deadline. She trained Peter Drummond to run the floor during her longer absences. She documented her supplier contacts and payment schedules in a new ledger with twice the detail of the old one. She wrote a long letter to her cousin in Missouri for the first time in 3 years, and received, with some surprise, a warm reply that reopened a correspondence she had long since written off. Elias proved, as she had suspected he would, to be an extraordinarily thoughtful partner through all of it. Not hovering, not anxious, but present, reliably and practically present, in ways that mattered. He came home from the Grayson place on time. He carried things she should not be carrying. He read to her in the evenings from the growing collection of books that had accumulated on the shelf above his desk, and she had developed a particular fondness for falling asleep to the sound of his voice over a chapter of something she had already read before and knew would not surprise her with anything alarming. Aldous Webb, who had by now entirely abandoned any pretense of passing through, had leased a small piece of land half a mile south of town, and was making preliminary efforts at establishing a kitchen garden, and possibly a small operation dealing in leather goods, for which he had some skill. He and Elias had resumed the friendship that the years of separation had put on hold, and Eva found that she genuinely liked him, his directness and his dry humor, and the way he spoke about Miriam without either avoiding the subject or dwelling in it. In September, nearly exactly a year after Elias Carson had first walked into Keller's general store trailing dust and carrying coins in his steady hands, Eva gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by the town's physician, Dr. Harmon Albright, who was no relation to the pastor, but had set up practice in Redemption Creek in 1876 with a solid competence and a gentle manner that Eva trusted. The labor was long and hard, as first labors often were, but Eva brought to it the same practical determination she brought to everything, and at 3 in the morning on a clear September night in 1879, with the mountains black outside the window and Elias' hand in hers with a grip that she had to twice remind him not to tighten, their son arrived. He was red-faced and vehement and loud in his objections to the world, which Eva considered promising. Elias held him with the particular care of a man who has not held a newborn before, and is intensely aware that he has not held a newborn before, and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Eva, who was exhausted in a way she had not known was possible and also, completely without warning, happier than she had ever been. "Heinrich," she said, "for my father." Elias looked up at her. She had not told him she was thinking this. He said it back, "Heinrich Carson," slowly testing it. Then he said, "Yes, good." Heinrich Carson, called Henry almost immediately by the practicalities of everyday speech, was from his earliest weeks an opinionated and investigative infant who expressed his feelings on all subjects with admirable directness. He had Elias' gray eyes, which Eva found privately amusing, and he had her nose, which Elias found privately amusing, and they both found everything about him remarkable in the way that parents find their first child remarkable, which is to say entirely and without objectivity. The town of Redemption Creek received Henry with the warm, proprietary interest of a small community that considers every birth a shared event. Dottie Me brought a quilt she had been working on for months. Rosaria Vila arrived with food enough to last a week. Even old Harlan Rhodes, who had apparently decided that Elias Carson's continued presence was survivable, sent over a crate of apples from his kitchen orchard that was an obvious gesture of good faith, if not exactly an apology. Aldous Webb became, without any formal discussion, the child's honorary uncle in the way that bachelor men of good character sometimes find themselves attached to the children of their friends. He was not expansive about it, but he was consistent, and Henry, who was developing opinions about the reliability of the adults in his world, approved of Aldous Webb with the straightforward certainty of a child who recognizes trustworthiness. Life settled into its new shape. The store ran. The Grayson spread ran. The mountains changed with the seasons, and the stage came on Thursdays, and the post brought letters that Eva now had enough good news in her life to receive without apprehension. Her correspondence with her Missouri cousin had become regular and warming, and in the spring of 1880, the cousin, whose name was Gertrude and who had 3 children of her own and a dry wit she had apparently been suppressing in her previous silence, wrote to say that she intended to visit in the autumn if the journey could be managed, and Eva wrote back that it absolutely could and please come. Eva and Elias had their disagreements, because 2 practical people with strong opinions and established habits of self-reliance will always have disagreements, and theirs were real and occasional, and resolved with the same directness they brought to everything. There was a genuine argument in February of 1880 about whether to take out an additional bank loan to finance a second expansion of the store, in which Eva was in favor and Elias was cautious, and they spent 3 evenings in considerable candor, establishing that his caution was rooted in something more than financial analysis, and her certainty was rooted in something more than confidence. And by the end, they had reached a modified plan that incorporated both their concerns and was probably better for it. There was a harder conversation in the spring about the Grayson foreman position, because John Grayson, who was getting older and whose sons were not interested in the land, had raised with Elias the possibility of a management arrangement that would have meant longer hours and more responsibility and less time in town. Elias brought the conversation to Eva before he gave Grayson any answer, which she found both deeply right and somewhat inconvenient, because she was the one who had to look at his face and understand that this was a thing he wanted even though he was prepared not to take it. She told him to take it. They would adjust. They adjusted. Eva promoted Peter Drummond to full store manager for the weekdays she needed him to be, a responsibility the young man took on with the serious pride of someone who has been trusted for the first time with something real. Eva reduced her own hours to what was truly necessary and found that the store ran approximately as well, which was both a relief and a mild affront to her ego. Henry learned to walk in May of 1880, which he treated not as a developmental milestone, but as the acquisition of a new weapon in his ongoing campaign to reach every object in the apartment that was not at floor level. Eva watched him pull himself to standing for the first time holding the edge of the kitchen table, and she felt a feeling so large and specific and particular that she had no name for it in any language she spoke. And she sat down on the floor beside him and laughed until she had to wipe her eyes, and Henry looked at her with Elias' gray eyes in a face that was entirely his own, and said, with tremendous conviction, a word that might have been Papa or might have been something else entirely, but which they decided to accept as Papa, because Elias came home from the Grayson place that evening and was told about it, and looked pleased in that deep, quiet way of his for the rest of the night. Gertrude arrived in October as promised, with her husband, a steady man named Carl Bauer, and their 3 children, the eldest of whom was 12, and immediately attached herself to the project of following Elias around with the hero worship that children of that age are capable of when confronted with a man who knows things about horses and the outdoors. Gertrude herself was Eva's cousin in the best possible sense, which is to say she had the same bone-deep practicality and a nearly identical sense of humor, and she and Eva fell back into the warmth of family connection with the ease of people who have always suited each other and have simply been too far apart for too long. Gertrude stayed 3 weeks, which was longer than planned, and when she left she said to Eva on the morning of her departure privately, while the men were loading the wagon, "I wrote you off, you know, after your father died. I thought you would close yourself entirely. I am so glad I was wrong." Eva looked at her cousin, whom she had not seen in years, and said, "So am I. The autumn of 1880 was good. The winters in Redemption Creek were survivable when you had what you needed, and they had what they needed." The store turned a genuine profit for the 3rd year running. Elias' arrangement with Grayson was working well. Henry was a year old and in excellent health and extremely opinionated about food. In November, Eva discovered she was expecting again. She told Elias in the same place she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and he received the news with the same still, grateful attention, and this time there was less surprise in it on both sides and more of something else, something that lived past surprise into the deeper country of a shared life. This pregnancy was easier than the first, which her body, now knowing something about the enterprise, seemed to manage with greater cooperation. Dr. Albright was reassuring and competent. Henry was a vivid and demanding companion throughout, requiring the full intellectual engagement of anyone in the apartment with him at any time, which Eva found both exhausting and genuinely amusing. In the spring, in April of 1881, their daughter arrived. She was calmer than Henry had been, from the very beginning, with a watchfulness about her that was somehow already a personality. Eva held her in the first hour and looked at her face and said, "Clara." Elias, who was not sitting on the floor this time but standing close enough that she could feel his shoulder against hers, said, Clara Carson, and it sounded exactly right. Clara was indeed calmer than her brother. She watched the world with deliberate attention and reached her milestones at her own determined pace, and very early developed the ability to stop Henry in his tracks with a look, which was a social skill Eva privately considered exceptional. Life with two children was full in a way that Eva had not imagined when she was running her father's store alone, filling the evenings with ledger books and deliberate practicality. The apartment was louder. The days were longer. There were evenings when she and Elias fell into bed exhausted and barely exchanged more than 12 words. There were mornings when one child or the other had been sick in the night, and the day began before sunrise in the gray way that only extreme fatigue makes familiar. None of it was what she would have called easy. All of it was what she would have called hers. Elias, in the deeper years of their marriage, proved to be everything the accumulation of evidence had suggested he would be. Present, steady, specific in his affection, which meant he did not generalize his love into vague warmth but expressed it in particular ways. The cup of coffee set on her side of the kitchen table before she was awake, the way he always came home from the Grayson place and looked for her first before doing anything else, the way he read to the children with the same quiet attention he had once given to newspapers in Rosaria's cantina, the way he came to her with things, problems and questions and uncertainties, as a matter of course, and without having to decide to do it first. The way he still, after years, looked at her in a room full of people as though she was the fixed point he was orienting from. She loved him with the same precision she had always loved the things she trusted most, completely and without qualification, and with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Aldous Webb formally established himself in Redemption Creek in the summer of 1881, purchasing the small property he had been leasing and registering himself with the county as a leather goods craftsman. His work was excellent, which became known, and he developed a trade with the ranching operations in the surrounding valley that kept him steadily occupied. He was a permanent fixture in the Carsons' lives, at the table on Sundays when he came for the meal Eva made, which she had begun several months ago as a practical gesture, and which had quietly become a tradition. Henry, at 2 and then 3, was a child of tremendous energy and genuine intelligence that sometimes got ahead of his judgment, which Eva suspected he had from her and Elias suspected he had from Eva, and which they both secretly considered promising. He loved the store with a proprietary passion that suggested Heinrich Keller's blood was running true through 2 generations, and he loved the Grayson spread with the outdoor passion that was entirely from Elias, and he loved Aldous Webb's leather shop with the fascinated intensity that children reserve for places where things are made by hand. Clara watched all of this with her deliberate, particular attention, and said less than her brother and meant more when she said it. In 1882, when Henry was nearly 3 and Clara was almost 1, the territorial government in Santa Fe issued new commercial regulations that affected storekeeping operations across New Mexico in ways that required paperwork and compliance Eva had to navigate carefully. She did navigate it, with the same efficiency she brought to all practical challenges, and in doing so she found herself in correspondence with a woman in Santa Fe named Isabel Montoya, who was also navigating the same regulations on behalf of a family business, and who was, in correspondence, plainly brilliant and extremely funny. They wrote back and forth through the spring and summer on commercial matters that became, by the autumn, a genuine friendship conducted entirely through the postal service. Everything continued to make sense. The story of their life had the logical, accumulating quality of lives actually lived, each thing following from the last with the slow coherence of time. In the late summer of 1883, Elias came home from the Grayson place one evening with a look on his face that Eva had learned to identify as the expression that preceded something important, and he sat down at the table and told her that John Grayson, who was 61 now and slowing with it, had made him a formal offer. The offer was this. Grayson would sell Elias a 1/3 share of the Grayson spread, the land and the operation, at a price that was fair and that Grayson was willing to take in installments over 10 years, because he trusted Elias and because he had no children interested in the land, and he wanted to know that what he had built was going to someone who would maintain it and grow it. Elias sat across from Eva and laid it out the same way he always brought things to her, plainly and completely, and then he waited. Eva looked at the numbers he had written down, and she looked at the man across from her, and she thought about her father coming to a territory that was not his with a wagon of goods, and a conviction that commerce was the lifeblood of civilization. And she thought about the 3 years she had run the store alone, and the ledger she had filled, and the debt she had paid off, and the way she had kept her head up through all of it because the alternative was unacceptable. She said, "We can make this work." He said, "I know." "I just wanted to make sure you wanted to," she said. "Elias, this is a ranch. Henry will lose his mind." He laughed, that low, real, surprised laugh that she still loved after 5 years. And she laughed with him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the children asleep in the next room and the mountains outside in the dark New Mexico night. And she thought, not for the first time but with particular clarity, that practicality had saved her and love had completed her, and she did not need to choose between them. They went ahead with Grayson's offer. The papers were signed in September of 1883 at the county office in the nearest settlement of any administrative size, with Aldous Webb as one of the witnesses and John Grayson looking satisfied in the particular way of an old man who has arranged things to his liking. The arrangement was structured carefully, the installments manageable, the operational division clear. Elias would continue as foreman and now also as part owner, with an increasing share of the decisions and the returns. Eva kept the store and ran it. She was not a woman who let go of things she had built. They did not move to the ranch immediately, because the apartment above the store was home, and the children were young, and the practical weight of 2 operations in 2 locations was enough without adding a domestic upheaval to it. But they talked about it, steadily and without urgency, the way they talked about everything that mattered, letting it develop its shape over time. Henry, who was 4 in the autumn of 1883, was told about the ranch share with the seriousness his personality demanded, and he received the information with an expression of concentrated satisfaction that was so purely his own that Eva had to look at the window not to laugh. Clara, at 2, was less impressed with the abstract concept of property, but very impressed with the actual ranch when they drove out to see it on a Sunday in October, specifically with the horses, one of whom permitted her approach with the patient tolerance of an animal that has encountered small children before and found them bearable. Life continued. Seasons turned. The store grew. The ranch operation improved under Elias' management in the ways that always occur when someone with both the knowledge and the genuine interest is in charge of something. The small efficiencies and the better decisions that accumulate into real results over years. In 1884, Eva received a letter from Gertrude that contained news of a different kind. Carl Bauer, Gertrude's husband, had taken ill. The illness was serious. Eva wrote back immediately with everything practical she could offer and everything personal she meant. The correspondence through that year was frequent and sometimes painful, and in the winter Gertrude wrote that Carl had died in November. Eva felt this loss from a distance with the particular ache of caring about someone and being unable to do more than words on paper. She wrote to Gertrude as often as she could and meant every word. Henry started his schooling in 1885, attending the small school that Redemption Creek maintained in a room behind the courthouse, taught by a young woman from Ohio, named Miss Prentice, who had the gift of capturing a child's attention that not all teachers possess, and that Henry, who had attention to spare but was selective about where it went, responded to with the enthusiasm of someone being appropriately challenged. Clara, watching her brother go off each morning with his slate under his arm, developed a deep impatience about not being old enough yet, which she expressed through the particular silence of a very articulate child who has decided that a protest is beneath her dignity, but wants everyone to know she is protesting. In the summer of 1885, Elias came home one evening later than usual, which was rare enough that Eva noticed, and when he came in the door and she looked at his face, she said immediately, "What is it?" He sat down and said, "John Grayson died this afternoon." She sat down beside him. John Grayson had been 63 and not well for the past year, and it was not a shock, but it was real and it was the end of something, and Elias felt it the way you feel the ending of something that has been important. They sat together in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and talked about Grayson with the specific care of a eulogy that does not need to be formal to be true. The legal and practical implications of Grayson's death became clear over the following weeks. His will, drawn up 2 years ago, confirmed the sale arrangement with Elias and added a provision that transferred Grayson's remaining 2/3 share to his nephew in Albuquerque, a young man named Ford Grayson who came out to look at the property in August and arrived with the uncertain manner of someone who has inherited something he does not know what to do with. Elias dealt with Ford Grayson with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and over 3 weeks of patient conversation established a continued arrangement that worked for both of them. Ford Grayson had no interest in ranching, but he had a sensible interest in continued income, and Elias' track record over 2 years of partnership with the elder Grayson gave the arrangement credibility. By the autumn of 1885, the situation had resolved itself as well as it was going to, which was well enough. Eva turned 32 in October. Elias turned 37. They sat on the porch of the apartment above the store on her birthday evening after the children were in bed, which was something they did when the weather permitted, with coffee and the quiet of the town settling around them, and Elias said, "You know what I think about when I sit here," she said. "What?" He said, "The morning I walked in and you told me your name. I was standing at your counter and you said Eva Keller like it was a simple statement of fact, and I thought, this is a person who knows exactly who she is. I had not felt that in a long time, being near someone who knew who they were." She looked at him in the low light of the late evening. "You knew who you were," she said. "You were just between versions." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a generous description." "It is an accurate one," she said. "You are very observant for a man who underestimates himself." He looked at her with those gray eyes and the crooked thing at the corner of his mouth. "I do not underestimate myself," he said. "I married you, did I not?" She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the cooling October night with the store below them and the town around them and the mountains in the distance under the early stars. And Eva Keller Carson, who had once believed that the life she had was the life she was going to have, let herself feel the full width and depth of the life she had instead. In the spring of 1886, she discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time. She told Elias at the kitchen table in the lamplight, as she had the first 2 times, and he received it with the particular warmth of a man who is no longer surprised by happiness, but has not stopped being grateful for it. Henry, who was 6½ and considered himself a participant in family decisions, was told and responded with serious deliberation that this was acceptable and he would help. Clara, who was 5 and had recently declared that she intended to become a doctor, which Eva found extremely plausible, said she would be very good at helping with a baby because she had studied the matter and felt confident in her ability. The pregnancy went well. Eva worked through it with her usual efficiency and the particular additional wisdom of someone who had done this before and knew which parts required accommodation and which parts she was perfectly capable of ignoring. Dr. Albright, who had been delivering Redemption Creek's children for 10 years now and had a warm competence that had only improved with practice, was reassuring and present. In October of 1886, their second son arrived. He was quiet where Henry had been loud, observational where Clara had been deliberate, and he had Eva's brown hair, and what Elias described with some amusement as Eva's expression when she is thinking about something and does not intend to share it yet. They named him James William Carson, for Elias' father and his own name combined into something that felt both backward-looking and entirely forward. James arrived into a house that was practiced at receiving children and received him with the easy warmth of a family that had already found its rhythm. Henry was a conscientious older brother in the way of children who take their roles seriously. Clara was a thoughtful older sister in the way of children who take everything seriously and have already decided they are competent to manage most situations. The late 1880s moved over Redemption Creek with the gathered pace of a community growing into itself. The town had expanded some, not dramatically, as the territory was still frontier in its bones, but enough to have added a second general goods supplier, which meant Eva adjusted her commercial strategy with the unsentimental clarity she had always applied to competition, improving her service and her supplier relationships and her prices where she could. She held her ground and then some. Elias' arrangement with Ford Grayson in Albuquerque continued on workable terms, and the ranch operation under his management became one of the steadier operations in the valley. He was known in the surrounding territory as a man of his word and reliable judgment, which were the two most important commercial reputations in the cattle country of New Mexico. Aldous Webb, now permanently woven into the fabric of their lives, attended every Sunday dinner with the faithful regularity of a man who has found his place and is sensible enough not to question it. He was getting older, the gray spreading from his beard to his temples, and he had slowed some, but his work remained excellent and his company remained, Eva thought, one of the quietly good things in their life. In 1887, Gertrude wrote from Missouri that she was considering a larger change. Her children were grown and out, or nearly so, and the house in Missouri felt, she said, more like a monument to the life she had been living than a place she was still living in. She asked, with the directness of a woman who had stopped hedging her questions, whether Eva thought she would be unwelcome in New Mexico territory. Eva wrote back, "We have a spare room and a Sunday dinner tradition, and I would not call it unwelcome if you came and never left." Gertrude arrived in the autumn of 1887. She came with 2 trunks and a cat named Friedrich, and the settled look of someone who has made a decision she is at peace with. And Eva stood on the platform where the stage stopped and watched her cousin climb down, and felt the particular warmth of someone returning to her that she had not known. Until that moment, she had been missing. Gertrude rented a small house 2 streets from the store and established herself in Redemption Creek, with the practical efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years managing a household and was not going to be flustered by a new setting. She and Eva fell into a rhythm that was new and also felt like something recovered, and she became, without formal announcement, a part of the daily life that Eva had never known she wanted to have. Henry, at 8, was in school and excelling in ways that Miss Prentice communicated to Eva with the specific pleasure of a teacher who has a student who actually challenges her. He was interested in everything mechanical and geographic, and had recently become absorbed in maps to a degree that led to his borrowing every atlas and survey document that came through the store's stock. Elias had begun talking to him about the land and the territory in the evenings, not as lessons but as conversation, and Henry absorbed it all with the cataloging intensity of a boy who is building a model of the world in his head. Clara, at 6, was in school and was the kind of student who finished her work first and then waited with transparent patience for the rest of the class, which Miss Prentice managed with the tact of an experienced educator. Her stated ambition of becoming a doctor had not wavered and had in fact become more specific. She now wished to practice medicine specifically relating to women and children, which she had identified as an area of particular need. Eva told her she was right about the need, and she believed she could do it. James, at 1 and then 2, was discovering the world with the quiet thoroughness of a child who examines things before acting on them, which was a temperament that made him restful to be around compared to his elder siblings, and which Eva privately found completely charming. In 1888, Elias turned 40. He told Eva on the morning of his birthday, drinking his coffee at the kitchen table before the house was fully awake, that 40 felt different than he had expected it to. Different how? She asked. He thought about it the way he thought about things that mattered. Good, he said. Settled. Like standing on ground that is actually solid. She looked at him across the table. His hair had some gray in it now, at his temples and in the line of his jaw, and there were deeper lines around his eyes, and he looked more like himself than he had the day he walked into her store covered in dust with his hat pulled low. She thought he was more beautiful at 40 than he had been at 30, and she told him so, which made him laugh and say she was biased. She said she was not biased. She was accurate. There was a difference. He reached across the table and took her hand in the way he had been taking her hand for 10 years, and they sat there in the morning light while the children slept, and the store waited, and the mountains were bright in the early sun. The territory of New Mexico was changing around them through these years, as territories do when they are approaching statehood, and the full weight of an expanding American nation is settling on them. The railroads had come closer, with a line through the region that moved goods faster and cheaper than the old stage routes, and this was good for commerce and complicated for the kind of quiet frontier life that towns like Redemption Creek had built over the decades of territorial isolation. Eva adapted. She had always adapted. She expanded her supplier network to take advantage of the railroad shipping, which improved her costs and her inventory depth. She corresponded with Isabel Montoya in Santa Fe about the commercial shifts, their letters now a decade old and a friendship she valued deeply, even having never met the woman in person. She managed the store with the same clarity and efficiency she had always brought to it, and she trained Peter Drummond, who was now 26 and had been with her since he was 15, with the explicit and stated intention of the store eventually becoming his to run when she chose to step back. She was not ready to step back yet, but she was thinking about what came after, which was a kind of luxury that required having built something real. In 1889, the spring brought an unexpected visit. Elias' brother Thomas came from Kansas. Eva had known about Thomas Carson for years, from letters and from Elias' descriptions, the younger brother who had stayed on the land when Elias went west, who had built a farm in Kansas with a woman named Ruth and raised 3 children in the flat grass country. They had corresponded irregularly over the years, and there was between them the particular warmth of brothers who had grown up close and grown apart through circumstance, and who found, on the occasions they reconnected, that the closeness was still there under the distance. Thomas arrived with Ruth and their youngest child, a boy of 12, on the stage from Albuquerque in early April, and Eva watched Elias greet his brother in the street outside the store and felt something she could only describe as completion, because here was the rest of the story she had been only partly knowing, the family and the before and the origin of the man she had married. Thomas Carson was different from Elias in the way that brothers shaped by the same origin and different paths are different. He was broader and louder and more immediately warm, with a humor that came easily to the surface and a goodness underneath it that Eva recognized instantly as the same quality she had recognized in Elias the first week he came to her store. Ruth was a quiet, competent woman who had the look of someone who has been managing things for a long time and has achieved a very complete peace with her own capability. They stayed 2 weeks. There were meals and conversations, and the children all together in the apartment above the store, in a noise and warmth that Eva had never had growing up, and found she had a great deal of capacity for. Thomas and Elias talked the way brothers talk who have been apart too long, the past and the present and the specific language of a shared childhood that no one else in the room entirely speaks. On the last evening before Thomas's family left, the two brothers sat on the porch while Eva and Ruth were inside with the children, and Eva heard through the open window Elias say something in a low voice that she did not entirely catch, and Thomas say back, clearly enough to hear, "I can see that. You found your place." And then quiet. She looked at the lamp on the table and felt the full, specific weight of being known in the way that only comes when someone who has known you from before can confirm the shape of the person you have become. Thomas and his family left on the stage to Albuquerque on a Thursday morning, and Eva stood beside Elias in the street and waved until the stage turned the corner past the farrier's shop, and then they stood there for a moment together in the bright April morning. "You miss him," she said. "Yes," Elias said, "but not the same way I used to. Missing used to feel like something was wrong. Now it just feels like the distance between two things that are both all right." She took his hand. They walked back into the store. The years that followed were the years of a life building on its own foundation, with the quiet accumulation that is the truest kind of abundance. Henry, growing into his teens, had settled on an ambition to work with land and possibly work in territorial government, a combination that made sense for someone who was equally fascinated by maps and by the principles that governed how land was used and who had access to it. Elias encouraged this, talking with him about the territory's history and its legal structures with an engaged seriousness that delighted Eva every time she heard it. Clara, at 13, had the focused determination of someone who has decided on her path early enough to have already started walking it. She read everything she could find about medicine and biology and kept a notebook of questions she intended to ask a doctor someday, which she had partially begun doing with Dr. Albright, who received her questions with the genuine pleasure of a physician who has not had a student in some time. Eva watched this and thought, "She will do it. She will genuinely do it." James was quiet and thorough and had, around age 7, developed a profound attachment to the leather working shop of Aldous Webb, who received this attachment with an unsentimental pleasure that had gradually transformed into something resembling mentorship. James spent his Saturday afternoons in the shop, watching and then helping and then, incrementally, learning. Webb taught him the way he did everything, without ceremony, just by doing and expecting the same. Aldous Webb was 60 now, or thereabouts, his age being something he referred to with vague approximation on the grounds that exact counting was for men with too much time on their hands. He was slower and his back troubled him in the cold months, but he was still present at every Sunday dinner and still working his leather trade on the days his back allowed, and he had the settled, undemonstrative contentment of a man who has made his peace with the shape of his life. Eva was 38 in the autumn of 1891. Elias was 43. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the days cooled, the mountains turning their autumn colors of sage and ochre, and they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have spent 15 years learning the language of each other's thoughts. She looked at him sometimes and thought about the afternoon she had found the second locket in the floorboards and held it in her hand and asked him who M was, and how terrifying that moment had been, the threat of losing something she had not yet admitted she had. And she thought about everything that had come after, the patience and the honesty and the slow, exact way they had built this life together. And she thought that the best things had not been the dramatic moments, though those had mattered. The best things had been the ordinary ones, the cup of coffee set on her side of the table before she was awake, the way he looked for her first, the lamp on the kitchen table and the sound of his voice reading to the children and the mountains outside in the dark. In 1892, on the occasion of their 14th wedding anniversary, Elias gave her a gift she did not expect. He had commissioned a silversmith, a craftsman in Santa Fe who had been recommended by Isabel Montoya, to make a new locket. It was the same shape and size as the original, the E-locket, but newer and without tarnish, and when she opened the clasp she found inside a tiny oval portrait of the two of them, so small it required squinting to see clearly, sitting on the porch above the store in the particular easy way of people who are completely at home with where they are. He said, "The first one was a beginning. This one is for everything after." She looked at the portrait, and then at him, and then she put the locket on and held it against her sternum and felt the warmth of it against her skin. And she said, "You know that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Elias Carson." He said, "You already happened to yourself. I just had the good sense to stay." She laughed and held on to him, there in the kitchen of the apartment above the store, with the children's sounds coming from the other rooms and the mountains outside in the clear blue autumn sky, and she thought that this was what it meant to be completely arrived at the life you were supposed to have. They stayed. They both stayed. Redemption Creek continued around them with the small, daily motions of a community that had found its own form. The territory continued its long, complicated process of becoming something defined. Henry grew, Clara grew, James grew. Aldous Webb got older with his characteristic lack of complaint. Gertrude was a permanent and beloved presence 2 streets over with Friedrich the cat. Peter Drummond ran the store 3 days a week and called Eva in when her opinion was needed, which was less often than she had expected and slightly more than she was ready to admit. In 1893, Clara turned 12 and began attending the school in Albuquerque that Dr. Albright had identified as the best available option for a girl with serious academic intentions, which required a particular kind of courage from both Clara and from Eva, who had to let her go, and which Clara accomplished with the contained determination that was entirely her own. She wrote letters home every week with the disciplined regularity of someone who has been trusted with a large thing and intends to honor it. Henry, at 14, was working summers at the ranch alongside his father, learning the land operation with the same cataloging intensity he brought to everything, and he and Elias had developed the particular companionship of a father and son who are, at their cores, built to understand each other. James was 8 and still spending his Saturdays with Aldous Webb, and his hands were already developing the particular calluses and the particular precision of someone who works with leather. And when he showed Eva something he had made, a small decorative piece, flowers pressed into the leather with a tool his own size, she looked at it and felt the specific pride of a parent who has watched their child find the thing they are genuinely made for. Elias watched all of it with the quiet, grateful attention of a man who could not have imagined this life from any point in his past, and who knew it, and was not afraid to know it. He said to Eva once, in the evenings when they were on the porch and the children were in bed and Redemption Creek was settling into its night sounds, that he thought about his younger self sometimes, the man riding into towns looking for nothing in particular and felt something that was not exactly pity but was very close to tenderness. He did not know what he was looking for, Elias said. Eva was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he knew enough to stay when he found it. Elias looked at her in the porch light and said, yes, he knew that much. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat there together in the evening, the two of them, in the life they had built out of chance and honesty, and the particular courage of people who have been alone long enough to know exactly what they are choosing when they choose to stop. And the mountains stood in the dark around the town, and the stars were very clear over New Mexico, and the store was below them and the children were inside and the future was in front of them, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing hidden, no dark past that had not been brought into the light and accepted, no secret that had not been spoken, no distance that had not been crossed. There was only this. The two of them, the lamp, the mountains, the life that had begun the afternoon she found a second locket in the floorboards, and a man with gray eyes had told her he had left it there for safekeeping, and had meant something much larger than she understood at the time. She understood now. She held onto his hand in the October evening and let the full weight of everything settle through her, all of it, the grief she had carried and the loneliness she had outgrown, and the love she had not been looking for, and had found anyway in the most practical, most impractical, most completely right way possible. Elias Carson had come into her store on a Wednesday in late September of 1878 with flour and salt and tobacco and cartridges and gray eyes and a crooked almost smile and 2 silver lockets in his pocket, one with a dead woman's initial and one with the letter that was hers. And he had stayed. And she was glad, every day and in every ordinary, extraordinary moment of the life they had built, that he had.